Every night in medieval Florence, thousands of people went to sleep knowing their neighbour, 50 meters away, wanted them dead. So how did they survive it? The answer is not walls. It is not guards. It is not fleeing the city. It is something that turned Florence into a place that looked more like Lower Manhattan than any medieval city you have ever imagined. The answer begins with the tower. Florence in the 13th century was a city of roughly 30,000 people, divided into two factions. The Guelphs supported the Pope, the Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor. These were not political parties in any modern sense. They were armed factions that fought each other in the streets, demolished each other's buildings, confiscated each other's property, and issued death sentences against each other's members. The conflict began in 1215 and lasted 3 centuries. The violence was not occasional, it was structural. When the Ghibellines took control of Florence in 1248, they expelled the Guelph families and demolished their towers. When the Guelphs returned, they did exactly the same. The Ghibellines destroyed more than 85 Guelph towers over the course of the conflict. The Guelphs destroyed even more in retaliation. Houses were burned, property was confiscated and divided between the victors. Death sentences were issued against men who were not even in the city. A Guelph family living in Florence in the 1240s did not need to imagine what defeat meant. They had watched it happen to their neighbours. They knew precisely what was at stake every night they went to sleep. So they built. At its peak in the 13th century, Florence contained approximately 160 private towers rising to heights of up to 65 metres. That is roughly the height of a 20-storey modern building. Contemporary reconstructions of the medieval city look less like a medieval European town and more like Lower Manhattan, a dense forest of stone rising above the streets. This was not coincidence, it was not status. It was a security system built in direct response to a specific documented threat. The engineering of a Guelph tower house was built around one principle: make entry from the street impossible. The ground floor was solid stone, no windows, no door, no entrance of any kind at street level. The walls were up to 2 meters thick enough to withstand the mangonels and siege equipment that factions routinely deployed against each other in street fighting. Contemporary accounts describe urban combat using the same equipment found on military battlefields, catapults, battering rams, and fire. This was not brawling, it was warfare conducted inside a city of 30,000 people, in the same streets where those people bought bread, attended church, and conducted their daily business. The only way into the tower was from above. A retractable wooden staircase or a wooden balcony extended from the roof of a neighbouring building and connected to the upper floors. In an emergency, that access point could be pulled back or destroyed in seconds. The tower was sealed. No entrance, no vulnerability at street level. Why does this matter for sleep? Because a Guelph family under attack at 2 in the morning had one move: retreat into the tower, pull up the access point and hold. The attackers below faced 2 meters of solid stone and no entrance. The defenders above had height, visibility, and the ability to drop projectiles on anyone who approached. The tower did not need to defeat the enemy, it only needed to hold until the situation changed. But the tower was not just a refuge, it was a military position that operated around the clock. The upper floors were dedicated to defence. Guards rotated through the night on a fixed schedule. A man posted at the top of a 65-metre tower could see movement across the entire neighbourhood. He could identify Ghibelline activity several blocks away. He could signal to allied towers using pre-arranged signals, fires, flags, or reflected light. He could track the approach of a threat in time for the family below to arm themselves and prepare before anything reached their street. Sleep in a Guelph tower house was not a private act of vulnerability, it was a collective operation. The women and children slept in the interior floors. The armed men rotated through the watch on the upper floors. The schedule ran every night, regardless of whether conflict seemed likely. The families that understood the system understood that the quiet nights were not evidence the system was unnecessary. They were evidence the system was working. The watch rotation had a specific logic. 4 men could cover a full night in 3-hour shifts without anyone being awake for more than 3 consecutive hours. A tower with 6 armed retainers could maintain continuous coverage with men available for rapid response if the alarm was raised. The families that maintained this discipline consistently, every night, for years and for decades, were the families that survived the conflict across multiple generations. The ones who relaxed the schedule on quiet nights are the ones the records do not mention again. This system had one structural vulnerability: isolation. A single tower, however well defended, was still one building. A coordinated assault from multiple directions at once could overwhelm it. A fire set on 2 sides at the same time could force defenders to choose. A tower standing alone was a harder position than a tower standing as part of a network. The Guelphs understood this, and they solved it with the consortium. Allied Guelph families built their towers in clusters, and they connected them physically. The connection was engineered specifically for this purpose. Wooden drawbridges were supported on long poles inserted into holes built into the tower walls, linking one Allied tower to the next across the gaps between buildings. These bridges allowed Allied families to move between towers without descending to street level at any point. Reinforcements could cross from one tower to another while combat was happening in the street 30 meters below. Supplies could be transferred. Women and children could be evacuated through the network to a tower further from the fighting. A coordinated defense could be mounted across multiple buildings simultaneously without anyone being exposed on the street. Some towers went further than simple alliances between neighbouring families. They were owned collectively. The consorterie, the tower societies, were formal legal arrangements in which multiple Allied families jointly owned a single tower. They shared the construction cost, the maintenance cost, the cost of the armed retainers who staffed the guard positions, and the defensive benefit equally. A tower owned by a consorterie type of 5 families had 5 families' worth of armed men available to defend it. 5 families' networks of political intelligence about Ghibelline movements. 5 families' combined resources to maintain the system indefinitely. The consorterie also solved a specific problem: what happened when one family in the network was temporarily weakened by death, by financial difficulty, by the temporary absence of its fighting men on external business. Single family tower, a period of weakness was a period of vulnerability. In a consorterie tower, the other families compensated. The network absorbed the weakness and maintained the defense. When an alliance between 2 families ended, and alliances ended regularly in the volatile politics of Guelph Florence, the physical connection between their towers was severed. The bridges were cut. 2 families that had shared a crossing the previous night were now isolated from each other, each responsible only for their own defense. The phrase "cut the bridges" as an expression for ending a relationship enters European languages from exactly this practice. It describes something that happened in real cities, between real families, with a hand tool and immediate security consequences. The height competition that produced Florence's extraordinary skyline had a direct military logic behind every additional metre. A taller tower commanded more of the surrounding area visually. It could see over the towers of enemies and allies alike. It could receive signals from Allied towers that shorter structures could not reach. It provided more floors of defensible space, more capacity for stored supplies and armed men. Every additional metre of height was an additional tactical advantage that translated directly into the ability to survive the night when the faction below yours decided to act. The competition was so intense that some towers collapsed during construction. The walls were built too quickly. The mortar had not cured. The weight at the upper floors exceeded what the foundation could support. Families kept building anyway. This is where the contrast with the rest of medieval Europe becomes significant. In most medieval cities, wealthy families built houses that offered comfort and displayed status. Large halls, stone walls, good furnishings. Security was a secondary consideration, addressed by locks, gates, and the general expectation that civic order would prevail most of the time. In Cologne, in Paris, in London, A wealthy merchant built a house. He did not build a fortress. In Florence, wealthy families built something categorically different. Sealed ground floors, 2-meter walls, retractable entry points, rooftop guard positions running through the night on a fixed rotation. Connected networks of allied towers linked by bridges that could be cut in seconds. These were not houses with security features added on. They were military installations that families happened to live inside. No other medieval European city produced this architectural response at this scale. The best evidence that the system worked is visible today in a small Tuscan town 56 kilometers from Florence. San Gimignano, a town that kept its towers. Today, 14 of its medieval towers still stand at or near their original heights. The town looks exactly like what Florence looked like at the height of the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, a dense cluster of stone towers rising above the surrounding landscape. Each one a private fortress, each one a statement of factional affiliation and military capability. Walking through San Gimignano today is the closest available experience to walking through medieval Florence at its most dangerous. The identification system that surrounded the towers extended the defensive logic into every visible aspect of daily life. Ghibelline structures had swallow-tailed crenellations, battlements cut in a forked shape, visible from a significant distance. Guelph structures had square crenellations. A guard on the upper floors of a Guelph tower could scan the rooftops of every surrounding building and produce an immediate intelligence assessment of the factional geography of his neighbourhood. Which buildings were allied, which were hostile, which had changed since the previous night. The identification extended to personal appearance. In 14th century Lombardy, Guelphs wore white feathers on the right side of their hats. Ghibellines wore feathers on the left. Gold medals on the right ear meant Guelph. On the left, Ghibelline. Even the way a man cut fruit at a dinner table could signal his faction to someone watching. These were not fashion choices. They were survival tools. The system worked for the families who could build it. For everyone else, it offered nothing. The ordinary Guelph, the tradesman, the craftsman, the labourer who supported the faction but could not afford a tower, lived in an ordinary house at street level. Wooden door, standard walls, no height advantage, no guard rotation, no network of allied towers. When fighting broke out in their neighbourhood, they locked their doors and waited. Some did not survive the waiting. The tower was a privilege. Security in Guelph Florence was a direct function of wealth and political connection. You slept safely if you were Guelph and rich. Otherwise, you slept in the middle of someone else's war with no protection the system had built for you. The city government of Florence recognised what the tower competition had produced and moved to limit it. In 1251, following a period of Guelph consolidation, Florence issued an order that all towers in the city were to be reduced to a maximum height of 29 metres. The Florentine historian Giovanni Villani recorded the order in his chronicle, noting that the towers at their peak reached 70 metres, and that the stones removed from the cropped sections were used to build new houses in the Oltrarno district. The order was not fully obeyed. Some families complied immediately, others delayed for years. The system continued to operate in modified form because the threat that had produced it had not ended. The towers were shorter, the sealed ground floors remained. The guards remained. The wooden bridges remained. The Ghibellines were still in the city. The conflict eventually consumed even those who had built the best towers and maintained the most reliable alliances. After the Guelphs consolidated dominance in 1266, the faction divided internally. Black Guelphs backed full papal authority and close ties to Pope Boniface VIII. White Guelphs opposed papal interference and supported greater civic independence. The towers built to defend against Ghibellines were now deployed by Black Guelphs against White Guelphs. The system was identical. The enemy had simply changed faction. Among the White Guelphs was Dante Alighieri. He had fought at the Battle of Campaldino in 1289 as a Guelph cavalryman. He had served as one of the 6 priors of Florence in 1300, the highest civic office available. He was a Guelph in good standing with connections across the faction and a position within the system the towers had been built to protect. In 1302, the Black Guelphs took control of Florence, backed by Charles of Valois and Pope Boniface VIII. Dante was charged with financial corruption. He was given a deadline to present himself for judgment and pay a fine. He did not present himself. In his absence, he was sentenced to permanent exile. The sentence included one specific provision. If he ever returned to Florence without authorization, he could be burned alive. He never returned. He wrote about what exile meant in a single passage in the Paradiso. A Florentine ancestor describes the experience to him directly, how salty is the taste of others' bread, and how hard the path going up and down on others' stairs. He spent 19 years moving between the cities of northern Italy, Verona, Bologna, Ravenna, sleeping in houses that belonged to other men, climbing stairs that other families owned, dependent on patrons who could withdraw their support at any time. He died in Ravenna in 1321. Florence kept his bones for centuries, refusing to return them. They are still in Ravenna today. The Uberti family, Ghibelline leaders, had their towers demolished by the Guelphs after 1266. When the city government later built its civic palace, what became the Palazzo Vecchio, it chose its site carefully. Villani recorded the reasoning explicitly. The city hall should not have its foundations on the land of the rebel Uberti. It stands off-centre in the piazza today, not for aesthetic reasons, not for architectural reasons, because Ghibelline land was considered too politically contaminated for civic use. Even after the family had been destroyed, their towers demolished, their members dead or exiled for 2 generations. The hatred outlasted the people who had felt it. Walk through the centre of Florence today and look carefully at the buildings, where you see a section of rough, hand-cut stone rising above the smooth stucco of the surrounding walls, especially where it rises to a flat, abrupt top rather than a natural roof line. You are looking at the base of a medieval tower. The upper section was removed in 1251. The lower section was incorporated into later construction, built around, built above, preserved inside the walls of buildings constructed over the following centuries. Most people walking through Florence today pass these remnants without recognizing what they are. They look like irregular sections of older wall. They are the foundations of a security system built to solve a specific problem. How do you sleep in a city where your neighbor wants you dead? The Guelphs slept because they built a system that made sleep possible. Stone walls 2 meters thick, ground floors sealed against entry. Rooftop guards rotating through the night on a fixed schedule. Wooden bridges to allied towers that could be cut in seconds if an alliance ended. Tower societies that distributed the cost and the defense across multiple families simultaneously. They slept because they understood that security in a city divided against itself was not something the law provided, or the church guaranteed, or the political situation allowed. It was something you built, maintained, and defended every single night for as long as the conflict lasted. The conflict lasted 3 centuries. What do you think determined survival in a city like this? The height of the tower, the strength of the alliance, or the reliability of the guards? Leave your answer in the comments below. Subscribe. More medieval history coming.